senior consultant in the company. And we will walk you through what we think are the megatrends in market access pricing and reimbursement in Europe. So just quickly today, we're going to touch on what we think are the megatrends. We cannot go, of course, in details in all of them. We will talk about managed entry agreements, performer-based contracts, use of real-world data, and reforms on P&R processes. So to set the scene, like this is definitely true, as you all know, in Europe across all the countries, all payers are under quite a bit of pressure to contain costs, because we know that, of course, cost of healthcare in general is on the rise. And, you know, one of the key contributors for this high costs is definitely the cost of the therapies. And, you know, we can't ignore also what happened in the last 2 years with COVID. Of course, we had a lot of pressure on the healthcare budget. We had to quickly come up with vaccines, treatments, but most of all, we had a lot of people being actually ill, and, you know, the cost for hospitals being like far greater than anyone could ever expect. So thinking about this in this environment, we see that there are some trends that are currently happening in Europe, but most of these are valid, you know, also across the world, that are aimed to improve the access to medicine while trying to, you know, maintain, well, not maintain a low cost, but reduce the costs. So one, for example, is the growing implementation of early, for example, access program. This is what just we heard, you know, that is very important also for rare diseases. And this is aimed to really try to address the payer uncertainty around, you know, the financial impact, but also the performances of the new drugs. And we see that some of the trends, you know, are more relevant to payers and regulatories, like, for example, decreased pricing transparency. We know that in Italy, for example, we now have the Lista di Trasparenza, and then we also see other things happening more on the manufacturing side. That, for example, the manufacturing are like offering novel contracting payments at the moment that are also aimed to relieve this pressure on budget. And I would like to touch on the two trends that you see here on the bottom left, because I think these are the two things that also came out from a lot of discussion that we had yesterday. So one is definitely like digital technologies that we have seen like they had a massive acceleration in use in the last 2 years, like for collecting data, for monitoring patients. And personally, I really hope they're here to stay because they have been proven to be useful and hopefully reduce cost. And then, of course, the big thing is, you know, the rise in real-world evidence. And this is very important. Like, I'm a core scientist by training, and I really believe in data, and I'm really happy to see this because I really think that, you know, with the right collection, the right analysis, this can be like a good decision driver. So, nonetheless, like medicine continues to take quite a long time to reach the European patients. So we see that the EPA, like we just heard also in the previous talk, they had quite a long time for approval for the novel active substances compared to other agencies. And then also they approve less of this therapy through like accelerated pathways. So the time also can vary across Europe for the time that it takes for a patient to actually get the drug from the moment of approval. And on average, it takes 500 days, which is still quite a lot. And there is a lot of variability across countries, like German patients can have a drug basically in 50 days after approval, but if you look at Romania, like it takes over 2 years, so it's like a super long time. And there is also a difference in the percentage of the EMA-approved medicine that are made available to patients. So, for example, in Germany, 88% of the products are made available to them, but if you look at countries like Lithuania, it's only 70%. So there are really low numbers if we think about Europe. So, nonetheless, we have a growing pipeline, and there are over 8,000 medicines in development. And what I think is striking is that 74% of these are potentially first-in-class therapy, which means that they could also be very expensive. Not necessarily, but they have high potential to be. And we see that in 2020, the EMA approved 39 new active substances, and 3 of them were advanced therapy medical products. And the expectation is that in the next 5 years, we will have about 20 or 30 of these ATMP products filed annually. And on top of that, on top of all these new therapies, there are a lot also of very costly combinational therapies that are being tested now in clinical trials and or even already in the market. So all of this to say that the healthcare expenditure in Europe is going up. It has been gone up for the last 20 years, and I'm with Navin here, we expect that it's still on the rise. And this is especially, for sure relevant for example, a lot of rare diseases, like we just heard. A lot of rare diseases, for instance, are genetic diseases, and they can have very, very effective therapies for the patients, but then they cost millions. They are completely transformative. There are some children diseases, for example, that I'm a new mom, so thinking about that, if your child is sick, even if it costs 2 million, you would want it. But access is still difficult, and we have the example of Limeldi, for example, that has been approved in Europe, but at the moment only the UK has agreed on a reimbursement pathway. And you have also some other hidden costs, because for diseases like that one, early treatment is important, and sometimes you need to screen patients to identify the disease early enough. So who's going to pay for all the newborn screening, for example? This is another cost that people don't think about, but is very relevant for these therapies. So yeah, just to say that it's very important that this therapy reach the patients. But the big question is, how can we ensure access to these novel therapies while making it sustainable for the European healthcare system? So historically, and this is still the pathway that the majority of the drugs take to reach the market, a lot of the drugs, if you think about anything for diabetes, etc., the big drugs that a lot of us take, we have financial-based agreements with rebates, caps, etc. And we see this is differ country by country. We can have national or regional agreements, and we can see things moving forward. In Italy, every region buy the drugs for themselves, but in the last few years we have seen changings. If they try to buy biosimilar, now finally the regions are talking to each other, and they are getting bigger discounts, and therefore they pay less money, and they're able to treat also more patients. So we see movements in these directions. But sometimes access is still difficult for the novel costly therapy, and this is another example from Bluebird Bio, the beta thalassemia drug. So this drug, for example, was approved in June 2019, and actually the first patients was treated in Europe 2 years outside clinical trials, 2 years after approval, which is quite a long time. And in Germany, it was approved, but at the end of the day, the countries was not able to reach an agreement with the company, and the therapy was ultimately withdrawn from the market, which is, really sad to see. You hope you will never see, but this is actually, what happened. And we have, of course, more cases like this. So the question is, what is being done now to change this? What other pathways do we have? And I'll pass it on to my colleague Alberto to walk you through this.
So luckily, we are all very creative, and then we have to think of ways on how we can fix some of these issues. And in the last few years, we have seen really this creative thinking coming into the picture of pricing and reimbursement through what we now call the performance-based agreements. And luckily, we are seeing this just growing and growing every day, where more countries, more companies, more payers are implementing this type of agreements to really enable access to these very expensive, costly therapies, but that really have the potential to provide, in many cases, a curative solution for patients. So again, they have many names. We're going to discuss all these different names: performance-based, outcomes-based, evidence-based, sharing risk agreements. But in the end, this is really just innovative way of thinking to bring medicines to patients. And like I say, luckily we're seeing a growing number of countries and payers implementing this type of agreements. And in contrast to what happened to Zynteglo, now we see that performance-based agreements are really enabling the access to some of these other very expensive therapies, like CAR-Ts or cell and gene therapies. And across Europe, we're seeing a different type of agreements being employed and implemented through the different payers. And you can see just here the variety of types of agreements. But the bottom line is this innovative way of thinking on how to pay for these therapies is working because it's providing access to these expensive drugs. Now, this goes beyond just setting one standalone agreement maybe to these advanced therapeutic medicines like cell and gene therapies. We are seeing this use also for medical devices, but we are also seeing these now being used into the tender structure that is already in place in many countries. So we are implementing these kind of performance-based clauses into tenders to be able to provide with expensive medical devices or therapies. So you can just see here, 3 different medical devices that the access to these were enabled by performance-based clauses added to tenders. And beyond that, as Raquel just mentioned, we have also the case of now this gene therapy for metachromatic leukodystrophy, which is a rare genetic disease, being assessed through a performance-based agreement to provide access to patients on rare genetic diseases. And actually, 2 days ago, while we were arriving in Amsterdam, Nice was working hard, and they made a final decision to provide coverage for BioMarin's Biminci, which is for a rare genetic disorder, for routine use. And this is actually, an excellent precedent, because what happened is that BioMarin established a managed access program in the UK to generate evidence, generate real-world data on this rare disease. And now, after some years of collecting that data, they have proven that indeed it provides benefit to the patients, to the payers, and now Nice is providing routine access to this therapy. So again, performance-based agreements is not just for these large indications with lots of patients and standalone contracts, but actually it's a concept that we need to think about. It's about how we can assess the value of a therapy, a value of a medical device, and how we can provide access for that. Now, like I say, there are so many different types of these agreements. We can call them, performance-based, outcomes-based, evidence-driven agreements, or risk-sharing agreements. And this is very smart because it's very important to not think that one size fits all. We need to think exactly of the disease, of the therapy, of the healthcare system that we are engaging, of the payers' needs, so that we can come up with these novel solutions and tailor them to the needs of the payers, of the healthcare system, and of course, of the therapy. Regardless of what we do, if you notice something in the slides before, is that all of them are driven by the data. So we need to assess the performance, how these drugs are doing, what are the outcomes from these patients. We need to collect evidence, we need to collect data. They are all driven by data. And this is where the biggest challenge comes. And we heard extensively yesterday about the importance of data, but we also heard extensively about the challenges behind collecting the data. So how do we collect the data? And how do we collect it efficiently? That is not just in one hospital or one doctor collecting the data. And then importantly, who is going to collect the data? Who is going to process the data? Who can access the data? We're facing significant challenges now in the world of data, where privacy is a big issue, but at the same time, we need the data to assess the value of these therapies. So there are a lot of challenges behind this. It's not as easy as we make it sound. Let's go and collect data. Again, we need to think creatively when we want to bring this to the real world. And one of the examples that we have seen in the last couple of years actually is in Spain. The Spanish healthcare system, through a multi-agency effort, has established this platform called the Valtermed. And this is a platform that is central to the whole healthcare system. So it's a centralized platform, online-based, where pretty much physicians and pharmacists input data on the use of some of these therapies, which are expensive, in which there is still uncertainty on their value, to collect this data, gather the data, analyze the data, and then have it all together in one central location to be able to assess the real world value of these expensive therapies. And you can see here that it is still small. It only has 17 drugs currently in this platform, in this system. However, it is already better than 2 years ago when it was set up, because it started with 7. Now you have 17 drugs under assessment. It already has 225,000 patients enrolled in the system, which are being treated with these innovative drugs. And we have CAR T cells, we have gene therapies already being assessed. This is already being used for cases such as COVID, where they were assessing how to provide access to remdesivir for COVID patients. And also, it recently published data on, for example, Sanofi's dupilumab, which is, again, one of those very difficult diseases to assess the outcomes, because really it's a very heterogeneous presentation of the disease, which is atopic dermatitis. But the system is already collecting that data in a very homogenized approach to provide the evidence. So it's not impossible. We just need to think creatively on how to establish this type of systems and platforms. Now, beyond Spain, across Europe, of course, we're seeing a strong effort on how can we assess value, how can we optimize really access to medicines, but also how can we be conscious of the cost of healthcare across the board. So what can we do, both payers and manufacturers, again, to provide access to these medicines, but being conscious of the long-term sustainability of the systems? And we are seeing extensive changes in reforms, in policies, in frameworks across Europe. We are coming out with novel policies. But one common theme that you will see is that many of them are talking about added therapeutic value, real-world data, more evidence. So there is this big push, again, to have a more holistic approach to how we assess access to medicines. And of course, there is a strong effort to not only bring these policies, but to try to standardize it, to homogenize it, to make it more efficient. Instead of having 28 countries assessing their medicines in different ways, to maybe have one central approach that maybe can make everything quicker, easier, and cheaper for Europe. But the bottom line is, when we are thinking about assessing the value of a therapy, we need to think again holistically. We need to think that the value proposition goes beyond the drug itself, goes beyond the pill, and the drug needs to provide a healthcare solution. Because if you're having an amazing drug, but in the end you end up spending 10 times more because you need more physicians to care of those patients, or longer hospitalization, this is where the payers start, thinking twice about providing coverage to some of these therapies. So we just need to think in ways that we can address the healthcare issues, the uncertainties from these payers. So we will leave it with these questions on the screen to maybe open it for questions on the audience. What can we do to improve access? We are seeing that we're going on the right direction. This is trending in the right way, but we can do more, Are these performance-based agreements that we're establishing going to really be sustainable in the long term? Are they going to become, instead of a performance base, into a financial base in the long term? And beyond that, will these reforms across countries are sufficient, or do we need this centralized system to really accelerate this type of HT assessment? And like we discussed, how can we implement efficiently the collection of real-world data to drive this type of agreements? So with that, we want to thank you, and please, we will open it for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. So, yeah, just stand there. I think we're going to stand here, as we're told by the organizers. So I guess, fascinating, and thank you for that presentation. So a key point here is, from my Google search last night, about 8 out of 10 rare diseases are gene-based, right? Genetics. Yes. But gene science is relatively still new. And there lies the challenges for healthcare systems, is how do you, and it takes, I understand, about 4 or 5 years to diagnose a particular patient. So having a systems in place to be able to firstly identify these patients and what type of rare disease, it's a challenge to be tagged in with getting that drug to that patient. And I think there lies the problem. Any questions for our colleagues here? Yes, please. Right at the front. This table here. Thank you.
Thank you for this very nice overview of all these developments that we see already for some years now. And what strikes me is that the examples that you gave of the successes from these new arrangements are not that many. But I also am wondering, because in your talk I hear you speaking about payers and companies, what they should do. But I wonder what is the role of patient and healthcare providers in these new schemes and making it possible to be more successful with them.
Well, I guess definitely, for patients or healthcare providers, if we're talking about, collecting data, it's a very important point. I mean, you know now, by now, I think I'm Italian, but I live in the UK as well. But in the UK, you're asked more and more to share your data, also to share your healthcare data. And, it struck me, I had a conversation with friends that are not in science, but it struck me how many people still say no, they're not comfortable with that. So I think we need also information from the healthcare system, the healthcare providers, your doctor, to also encourage patients to share the information, because this is probably the first key points. So, and it is very hard, apparently, also to convince patients. I worked in amyotrophic lateral sclerosis for a long time, and my doctor's friends that see patients, they say that also in diseases like that is still a rare disease and very well known. We know the Heights Packet Challenge that it went on for a while. It has been well talked about. Still, a lot of patients also are not comfortable sharing the data, but with such small pool, if you don't collect it, then it's not helpful. So yes, definitely, patients and healthcare systems, they do have an important role, because we cannot do it without them.
And when we talk about rare diseases, I think this is the area where the patients work very, very closely with pharma companies. They are the ones pushing a lot of not just the development, but even the reimbursement. And they get engaged, and they suddenly become experts in the disease. So if we can take that example across the board, to any disease, where the patients really engage with it, it can drive not just the collection of data, but also, improve treatment adherence. And I think something that there is a big disconnect is that sometimes the patient doesn't know what to expect from a therapy, and they go to the doctor and they may say well, I feel better or not, and they're unsure, but actually they are the ones who should tell us the outcomes. And we are seeing more and more effort on patient reported outcomes as part of an endpoint for clinical trials and as part of performance assessment. So engaging them is really going to push this one step further, which is we're not just collecting the typical technical scientific endpoints, but we're actually collecting what matters for the patients, their reported outcomes, their quality of life, and it's going to add another dimension. So I think they are central to this process, and we need to think about how to bring it into the picture, as opposed to think about an added service or an added value.
Digital technology are actually coming to play quite a bit in this, because there are companies developing applications where patients can record how they feel, and they are making them as little games. So the more gamified they are, the more patients use it. But again, I think we've seen a lot of projects where they came to the realization that certain questions are answered well, certain questions are not answered as well through maybe an app system. So there is still, I think, a long way to go to find the right way to collect this level of information.
Well, I guess what I would say in response and put to you all is, as a mega trend, I would see that patient advocacy, patient organizations are going to be more and more important, particularly in the space of rare diseases, orphan diseases, but generally in any disease, actually. And we're beginning to see that right across the globe. How not only companies, but different organizations and stakeholders are engaging more with patients, because the expert patient in any disease area, as you can see with media access and availability of information, people are becoming more expert in managing their own disease. And if you own your own disease, that means you become slowly an expert, and therefore you demand more. And I think that's only going to be a big trend going forward. All right, I'm going to stop there. Thank you both very much for that. Lovely, well done.